Case 1. Edgar Valdez Villarreal, the outsider. They elevated. Who helped break the Beltran-Leyva empire? Edgar Valdez Villarreal was born on August 11, 1973, in Laredo, Texas. He grew up on the American side of one of the busiest border crossings in the Western Hemisphere, where 18-wheelers carrying legal goods crossed the same bridges that smugglers used to move product south to north every single night. He was a teenager with light skin and blue eyes in a world where most of the men who ran the trade looked nothing like him. The nickname they gave him, La Barbie, would follow him from the streets of Laredo into the highest levels of one of Mexico's most feared trafficking empires. Laredo has long served as one of the busiest commercial crossings between the two countries. Legal trade flows through its bridges every day, connecting American markets to Mexican manufacturing and agriculture. But alongside that commerce, illegal shipments of illegal goods have moved through the same corridors for decades. By the 1990s, Laredo was a key part of the illegal goods corridor that connected Mexican supply organizations to American demand. Young traffickers in the area were building connections with trafficking networks on the Mexican side of the border, learning the logistics of cross-border smuggling through direct experience and repeated transactions. He was not Mexican cartel royalty. He was an American who found a way in. He started as a smuggler, working the cross-border routes that linked Texas suppliers to Mexican sources. This was entry-level work in the trafficking world, but it provided essential education. Moving illegal goods across an international border required understanding customs patterns, developing relationships with Mexican counterparts, managing transportation logistics, and avoiding law enforcement detection. Each successful shipment built credibility with the organizations that controlled supply on the southern side of the border. His nickname tells part of the story. They called him La Barbie because of his light complexion and blue eyes, features that made him stand out in cartel circles, where most figures came from distinctly Mexican backgrounds. That appearance marked him as different from the moment he entered those circles, but it did not prevent his rise. What mattered inside these organizations was not where a man came from or what he looked like. It was whether he could move product, collect debts, and remain loyal under pressure. Valdez Villarreal proved he could do all three consistently over a period of years that gradually transformed him from a border smuggler into something far more significant. Over time, his smuggling connections expanded beyond local smuggling. He developed relationships with the Beltran-Leyva brothers, who at the time operated within the broader Sinaloa Federation alongside Joaquin Guzman and Ismael Zambada Garcia. The Sinaloa Federation was a loose alliance of trafficking groups that shared routes, suppliers, and enforcement resources while maintaining their own working cells. Within that alliance, the Beltran-Leyva faction handled major product transportation routes, enforcement operations, and territorial control across central Mexico. Valdez Villarreal aligned himself with the most aggressive of the brothers, Arturo Beltran-Leyva. Arturo valued two things above all else in his lower rankings: loyalty and results. These were not abstract concepts in the cartel world. Loyalty meant never providing information to rival organizations or federal agents, never skimming from shipments, and never pursuing independent operations without authorization. Active efficiency meant moving product on schedule, collecting payments in full, resolving supply problems without escalating them to leadership, and maintaining the disciplined secrecy that kept operations running smoothly under constant law enforcement scrutiny. Valdez Villarreal demonstrated both qualities. He handled product transportation routes, managing the movement of product through Mexican territory toward American markets. He coordinated enforcement operations, overseeing armed personnel who protected shipments and territories. He managed cross-border logistics, ensuring that product reached distribution networks in the United States. And he ran debt collection operations, recovering money owed to the organization by distributors and associates. By the mid-2000s, He was no longer just an associate. He had become a lieutenant inside one of the most powerful trafficking organizations in Mexico. That rise is significant because the Beltran-Leyva organization rarely promoted anyone without deep family connections or regional ties. In organizations built on family ties and regional loyalty, an American earning a seat at the leadership table required exceptional performance sustained over years. The Beltran-Leyva organization did not hand out authority casually. Valdez Villarreal earned it through reliable work across multiple areas of work, moving from the fringes toward the center of power. Understanding the significance of his rise requires context about how the Beltran-Leyva organization selected and promoted its members during this period. Mexican cartels in the 2000s were not systems based on performance in the traditional sense. Advancement depended on a combination of demonstrated capability, personal loyalty to specific leaders, regional connections, and often family ties that created presumptions of trustworthiness. An outsider without family connections had to compensate by being more reliable, more productive, and more loyal than individuals who benefited from built-in trust. Valdez Villarreal compensated by excelling in every active area he was assigned to. His track record of successful shipments, efficient debt collection, and reliable enforcement coordination created a body of evidence that leadership could not ignore. In an organization that measured value primarily through active results, his results spoke for themselves, regardless of his nationality or background. His rise also benefited from the practical reality that the Beltran-Leyva organization's cross-border operations required individuals who could operate effectively on both sides of the boundary. An American with connections in Texas and knowledge of U.S. authorities' patterns was a valuable asset for an organization that needed to move product across the border and return cash proceeds to Mexico. Valdez Villarreal's background, which might have been a disadvantage in a purely Mexican-based organization, became an advantage in one that depended on cross-border logistics for its primary revenue stream. His dual capability as both a Mexican-side field commander and an American-side logistics asset made him increasingly difficult to replace as his responsibilities grew. The organization became dependent on his performance in the same way that any enterprise becomes dependent on a key employee who handles multiple critical functions. That dependency gave him leverage and security within the organization, but it also meant that his eventual departure, whether through arrest, defection, or internal conflict, would create disruption that could not be easily managed. He was building toward a position that would make him the most powerful non-Mexican figure in the organization's history. That future was months away from becoming reality. The question was never whether he could handle the work. It was what would happen when the leadership structure around him collapsed. The Beltran-Leyva organization operated for years as a powerful faction within the Sinaloa Federation, the broad alliance of trafficking groups that dominated Mexico's smuggling trade through the 2000s. The Federation model allowed multiple leaders to share routes, suppliers, and enforcement resources while maintaining independent working cells. It was an arrangement built on mutual benefit, but also on fragile trust between men who controlled billions of dollars in illegal revenue. As long as that trust held, the Federation was nearly impossible for governments on either side of the border to dismantle. When it broke, the consequences would be severe. Under Arturo Beltran-Leyva, the cartel expanded aggressively throughout the decade. Product shipments moved in multi-ton quantities through corridors that connected Colombian suppliers to Mexican transportation networks to American distribution cells. Revenue reached hundreds of millions of dollars annually, funding corruption networks that paid off authorities' officials, political figures, and military personnel across multiple Mexican states. Territorial control extended across key regions in central Mexico, including Morelos and Guerrero, areas that provided both active bases and access to critical trafficking routes leading north toward the border. Valdez Villarreal was not standing on the edges of this machine. He was helping run it. As a top lieutenant, his responsibilities placed him at the center of the cartel. He coordinated armed enforcement groups, a role that required both tactical knowledge and the personal authority to command men willing to use extreme force. These groups protected shipments in transit, secured territorial boundaries against rival organizations, and carried out targeted violence against individuals who threatened the group's interests. Managing those groups meant making routine decisions about deployment, resource allocation, and the application of violence that shaped the cartel's relationship with its territory and its rivals. He managed trafficking cells across central Mexico, overseeing the movement of product from receiving points to distribution networks. Each cell operated semi-independently, handling specific segments of the transportation chain. Coordinating those cells required maintaining communication systems, ensuring handoffs between cells occurred smoothly, and resolving problems during transit without attracting law enforcement attention. A single disrupted shipment could cost the organization millions of dollars and create tensions that rippled through the entire supply chain. He maintained territorial control in regions where rival organizations were actively competing for the same corridors and markets. Territorial control meant more than physical presence. It meant managing relationships with local officials through corruption payments, maintaining surveillance of rival movements, positioning armed personnel at strategic locations, and responding to incursions with sufficient force to deter future challenges. Losing territory meant losing access to routes, revenue, and the perception of strength that kept competitors at a distance. Reports from Mexican authorities identified Valdez Villarreal as a senior decision-maker within the organization. This was not temporary trust. This was structural reliance. According to reports from Mexican security agencies, he appeared in intelligence briefings alongside the names of the Beltran Leyva brothers themselves. He commanded significant armed personnel across multiple areas of work. He operated with a degree of independence that signaled deep system-level confidence from the group's top leadership. Financially, his position granted direct access to revenue streams generated by trafficking operations. According to intelligence assessments, he maintained security details, armed escorts, and protected residences, markers of a man embedded in the upper tier of a criminal enterprise operating at international scale. Then, in 2008, the foundation underneath all of it cracked. Alfredo Beltran Leyva, one of the brothers, was arrested. The Beltran Leyva faction blamed Joaquin Guzman for providing information to authorities that led to the arrest. Whether that accusation was accurate mattered less than the belief behind it. The result was immediate. According to reports from both U.S. and Mexican authorities, the Beltran Leyva organization broke away from the Sinaloa cartel entirely, launched a war against its former allies that would reshape the landscape of Mexican organized crime. Valdez Villarreal became one of the field commanders during that conflict, coordinating enforcement actions against Sinaloa-aligned groups while simultaneously managing the group's ongoing trafficking operations. The split forced every member to choose a side, and Valdez Villarreal was firmly positioned as a central figure aligned with Arturo. For the next year, the war between the two organizations intensified across Mexico, with targeted attacks, territorial seizures, and armed confrontations becoming routine. But the war against external enemies was only the first crisis. A far more destructive conflict was about to erupt inside the organization itself. The 2008 split between the Beltran Leyva organization and the Sinaloa cartel deserves closer examination because it reveals how quickly alliances built on shared profit can collapse when suspicion enters the equation. For years, the Beltran Leyva brothers and Joaquin Guzman had operated within the same federation, sharing routes and resources in an arrangement that generated enormous wealth for all parties involved. The arrest of Alfredo Beltran Leyva shattered that arrangement, not because of confirmed evidence that Guzman had informed on him, but because the Beltran Leyva faction believed it to be true. In organized crime, the perception of betrayal carries the same weight as actual betrayal. Once the Beltran Leyva brothers concluded that Guzman had provided information to Mexican authorities, reconciliation became impossible. The accusation itself, regardless of its accuracy, poisoned every interaction between the two factions. Communication channels that had facilitated cooperation for years went silent. Shared territories became contested ground. Individuals who had maintained relationships across factional lines were forced to choose sides or risk being targeted by both. The speed of the collapse demonstrated how fragile cartel alliances truly are beneath the surface of shared profit. Valdez Villarreal operated at the center of this collapse. His role as field commander during the conflict meant he was responsible not only for fighting the Sinaloa cartel, but for maintaining the Beltran Leyva organization's internal cohesion during a period of extreme stress. Every decision he made during the war, from deployment of armed personnel to allocation of diminishing resources, shaped the organization's path. His effectiveness as a wartime commander increased his personal power within the organization, but it also deepened the factional lines that would eventually split the organization after Arturo's fall. The war against the Sinaloa cartel drained the Beltran Leyva organization's resources and attention at a time when it needed stability. Fighting an external war while simultaneously managing internal operations, maintaining corruption networks, and generating revenue through trafficking created pressures that no organizational structure could sustain indefinitely. By the time Arturo fell in December 2009, the organization was already weakened by more than a year of conflict with one of the strongest cartels in the world. According to official government reports, on December 16, 2009, Mexican Marines conducted a tactical operation in Cuernavaca targeting the leadership of the Beltran Leyva organization. The target was Arturo Beltran Leyva, the man who had built the faction into one of Mexico's leading trafficking empires, and who had personally elevated Edgar Valdez Villarreal from an outsider into a senior commander. The operation ended with the end of Arturo. The immediate effect was a leadership vacuum of the most dangerous kind. Arturo had been the central authority holding the faction together through a combination of strategic intelligence, personal relationships, and a willingness to use extreme violence against anyone who challenged his authority. His decision-making controlled territorial disputes and revenue distribution. His reputation kept competing internal factions aligned. Without him, those factions had no single figure to answer to, and no established mechanism for resolving the disagreements that his personal authority had previously managed. Two power centers emerged almost immediately, and neither was willing to submit to the other. On one side stood Hector Beltran Leyva, Arturo's brother, who claimed leadership as a matter of family lineage. Family succession was a traditional model in Mexican organized crime, and Hector's claim carried the weight of that tradition. On the other stood Edgar Valdez Villarreal, who had built up real power, armed personnel, and territorial control during the years he served as Arturo's lieutenant. His claim was based not on family, but on capability, on the men he commanded and the territory he controlled. The dispute could not be resolved through negotiation. Both men believed they had the right to lead, and both had the armed resources to fight for that claim. In cartel culture, losing a power struggle often meant losing your life, which meant neither side could afford to appear weak by backing down. The split escalated into open warfare that consumed the cartel from within. Targeted operations removed key figures on both sides, removing experienced operators and deepening the cycle of payback. Targeted attacks sent messages of intimidation across factional lines. Warnings were left publicly in cities and along highways to mark territorial claims and terrify opponents. Urban confrontations disrupted civilian areas across central Mexico. Mexico's internal intelligence reports from early 2010 described widespread fragmentation across every region where the cartel had operated. The organization was destroying itself faster than any rival or government operation ever could have. Territories that had functioned under Arturo's centralized command became contested battle zones where men who had once worked together now hunted each other. Regional commanders had to choose between Héctor's faction and Valdez Villarreal's faction, and those choices fractured working networks that had taken years to build. Some commanders chose based on personal loyalty. Others based their decisions on geo-clear proximity or survival calculations. The result was a patchwork of competing cells that could no longer coordinate large-scale trafficking operations. Splinter cells formed throughout the region. The unified structure dissolved into chaotic competition. The internal war weakened the group's ability to compete against the Sinaloa Cartel and Los Zetas, both of which exploited the chaos to seize territory and trafficking routes. Revenue declined as shipments were disrupted by fighting between factions that were supposed to be on the same side. This was not external pressure destroying a cartel. This was internal division, driven by ambition and the absence of centralized control. Edgar Valdez Villarreal, the American outsider who had been elevated into the inner circle, was at the center of that division. The fracture had begun. The full extent of the damage would only become clear after he was captured. The organizational collapse that followed Arturo's fall and the subsequent factional war provides a clear example of how cartels are often more fragile than they appear from the outside. The Beltran Leyva organization had projected an image of unified strength. It controlled territory across multiple states. It moved large-scale shipments with regularity. It maintained corruption networks that reached into government investigators and government. By any external measure, it appeared to be a durable, well-organized criminal enterprise. But that durability depended almost entirely on a single individual's ability to manage competing interests. Arturo Beltran Leyva had built the organization around his own authority, which meant that every relationship, every territorial arrangement, and every revenue-sharing agreement was ultimately guaranteed by his personal power. When that power ended when he was gone, every one of those arrangements became subject to renegotiation through violence. The men who had worked together under Arturo's command had done so not because they trusted each other, but because they trusted him. That distinction is critical. In organizations built on fear and profit, rather than genuine system-level structures, loyalty flows upward toward the leader, rather than laterally between lower rankings. Remove the leader, and the lateral relationships dissolve almost instantly. Valdez Villarreal's role in the factional war illustrated this perfectly. He had been loyal to Arturo, not to the Beltran Leyva family as an institution. When Arturo was gone, that loyalty had no object. Valdez Villarreal's power struggle with Héctor was not a betrayal of the organization in any meaningful sense, because the organization, as it had existed under Arturo, no longer existed. What remained was a collection of armed factions competing for resources and territory, each claiming to represent the legitimate continuation of Arturo's legacy while pursuing their own interests. Even Mexican intelligence analysts monitoring the group were caught off guard by how fast it fell apart. Within months of the loss of Arturo, the Beltran Leyva organization went from being one of the most powerful cartels in Mexico to a collection of warring splinter groups that posed more danger to each other than to any rival. Regional commanders who had once coordinated across state lines focused exclusively on defending their immediate territory against former allies. According to official reports, on August 30, 2010, Mexican federal police arrested Edgar Valdez Villarreal in the state of Mexico. Given his armed network and history of coordinating enforcement operations, authorities prepared for the possibility of violent confrontation. Instead, the arrest occurred without major resistance. Authorities presented him publicly to media shortly afterward. His detention removed one of the two competing power centers from the Beltran-Leyva conflict, but the damage to the organization had already been done. The charges reflected the full scope of his involvement at every level of the organization. In Mexico, he faced charges of organized crime, trafficking, and homicide allegations connected to the factional violence that consumed the organization after Arturo's removal. In the United States, federal charges were pending based on years of intelligence gathering, wire intercepts, witness testimony, and drug seizure records. According to court records, for 5 years he remained in Mexican custody while extradition proceedings moved forward. During that time, the Beltran-Leyva organization continued fragmenting. Without Arturo or Valdez Villarreal, the remaining factions splintered into smaller regional groups with diminishing coordination and reach. In 2015, he was extradited to the United States to face federal charges in U.S. District Court. The charges centered on conspiracy to distribute illegal substances, supported by extensive evidence, including communications intercepts, seizure records, and testimony from individuals previously arrested in connection with Beltran-Leyva operations. The evidence assembled by prosecutors described him as a senior field commander responsible for large-scale shipments, enforcement coordination, and a central role in the factional conflict that split the organization apart. Facing that evidence, he made a decision that cartel culture considers the most severe breach of loyalty possible. In January 2018, Valdez Villarreal pleaded guilty in U.S. federal court. While full cooperation details remain sealed, court filings indicate plea negotiations and reduced sentencing exposure. In cartel culture, silence is the code that holds everything together. High-ranking insiders who cooperate with federal authorities are viewed as the worst kind of traitors, because their knowledge has the power to expose entire working networks. The information he provided included structural intelligence about the Beltran-Leyva organization, clarified command structures, and strengthened federal cases against associates still facing prosecution. He received a reduced sentence under his plea agreement. He avoided life imprisonment and was not sentenced to maximum statutory exposure. For a man connected to large-scale trafficking conspiracy, the reduced sentence indicated meaningful credit for assistance from the court. By 2022, Edgar Valdez Villarreal was no longer listed in the Bureau of Prisons online locator. The Department of Justice has not publicly detailed his current status. Speculation exists regarding witness protection arrangements or sealed custody terms, but no official confirmation has been issued. The Beltran-Leyva organization never recovered its 2000s dominance. According to security analysts, regional cells survived in various forms, operating as independent criminal groups or aligning with other organizations. But the unified command structure that Arturo Beltran-Leyva once led, the structure that Edgar Valdez Villarreal helped operate and then helped destroy, was gone. What can be verified through public records and court filings is a clear sequence. He rose by delivering results consistently across every role he was given. He commanded power at the ground level of a major trafficking organization. He participated in the internal fracture that destroyed the organization's unity. He later entered a federal plea agreement that provided prosecutors with insider knowledge about the structure he had served. The path of the Beltran-Leyva organization after Valdez Villarreal's cooperation illustrates how internal damage compounds over time. The organization did not collapse in a single moment. Instead, it experienced a cascading series of failures that each made the next one more likely. Arturo's end removed centralized leadership. The factional war between Valdez Villarreal and Hector destroyed internal cohesion. Subsequent arrests of remaining leaders eliminated whatever coordination survived the war. And cooperation from insiders like Valdez Villarreal exposed the organizational structures that surviving members depended on. Each of these events was connected to the ones that preceded it. The factional war would not have occurred without Arturo's fall. The arrests of remaining leaders were facilitated by the chaos created by the factional war. The cooperation of captured insiders was made possible by the arrests, and the intelligence provided through cooperation made additional arrests and prosecutions possible, continuing the cycle. This pattern, where each collapse triggers the next, defines what happens when an organization is broken from inside rather than pressured from outside. External pressure, such as government enforcement operations, typically produces temporary disruption. Organizations adapt to enforcement pressure by changing routes, replacing arrested personnel, and adjusting active procedures. Internal destruction, by contrast, attacks the trust relationships and organizational knowledge that make adaptation possible. When insiders cooperate, they do not just provide information about current operations. They provide understanding of how the organization adapts, which allows government authorities to anticipate and counter those adaptations. Organizations like the Beltran-Leyva Empire prepare for threats from rivals and governments. They build security networks, corruption systems, and enforcement capabilities designed to withstand external attacks. What they rarely prepare for is the possibility that one of their most trusted leaders will become the force that breaks them apart from inside. Edgar Valdez Villarreal entered the cartel with no family name to protect him. But once he was inside it, he became the single greatest source of damage it ever faced. Before we move on to the next case, make sure to subscribe if you're finding these stories as disturbing as I am. It helps us keep covering the cases that most channels won't touch. While Valdez Villarreal destroyed the Beltran-Leyva organization by fighting for control of it, the next cartel leader destroyed his own empire by building an army so powerful it no longer needed him. Case 2. Osiel Cardenas Guillen, the cartel leader who raised an army that turned on him. Osiel Cardenas Guillen was born on May 18, 1967, in Matamoros, Tamaulipas, a city that sits directly across the Rio Grande from Brownsville, Texas. Growing up in Matamoros meant growing up in Gulf Cartel territory. The organization had controlled smuggling corridors along Mexico's northeastern border for decades, and Matamoros was one of the most valuable pieces of ground in the entire trafficking world. Osiel grew up knowing exactly who controlled it, and by the time he was in his 30s, he would control it himself. When the previous leader, Juan Garcia Abrego, was arrested in 1996 and extradited to the United States, the Gulf Cartel entered a period of instability. Multiple figures competed for control over the organization's routes and revenue streams. Osiel emerged from that competition by the late 1990s, and the methods he used to take full control set the tone for everything that followed under his command. He was not a man who preferred discretion. He was aggressive, confrontational, and willing to use extreme violence to achieve and maintain control. The Gulf Cartel's control of the northeastern corridor generated enormous revenue, and Osiel understood from an early age that holding that territory required more than political connections. It required the willingness to use force on a scale that most of his competitors were not prepared for. By 2000, Osiel was recognized by both U.S. and Mexican authorities as the dominant leader of the Gulf Cartel. Under his control, shipments increased in volume and frequency. Corruption networks that paid off local, state, and federal officials deepened in scope and reliability. Enforcement operations against rivals became more frequent and more intense. Territorial control strengthened across Tamaulipas and into neighboring states. He was building what he expected would become the dominant trafficking organization in all of Mexico, a group powerful enough to challenge even the Sinaloa Federation. One incident from 1999 illustrates the kind of leader he was. OCL allegedly threatened U.S. federal agents with weapons drawn in Matamoros after discovering their presence in the area. That confrontation was remarkable because cartel leaders generally avoided direct conflict with American law enforcement, understanding that such confrontations brought unwanted attention from the largest government in the world. OCL's willingness to threaten U.S. agents intensified American focus on him personally and made him a priority target for federal agencies. But OCL understood a problem that most cartel leaders of his era had not solved. Traditional gunmen were not enough to protect what he was building. Competition from rival organizations was growing. The Sinaloa cartel was expanding its influence across Mexico. Other regional groups were pushing into territory that the Gulf Cartel considered its own. Street-level enforcers could handle routine security tasks, but they lacked the training, discipline, and tactical capability to wage the kind of organized warfare that OCL believed was necessary to maintain his position against increasingly advanced rivals. OCL's calculation was straightforward. Street-level enforcers could hold a corner or intimidate a local official, but the Sinaloa cartel was not sending street fighters against him. They were sending coordinated teams with resources that dwarfed anything his local muscle could match. He needed men trained in real combat, men who could plan and execute military-style operations. And he found them among deserters from Mexico's own elite special forces. The decision he made next would reshape Mexican organized crime for the next 2 decades. To understand why OCL made this particular decision, it helps to consider the competitive environment of the late 1990s. Mexican trafficking was undergoing a transformation. The old model of relatively small, family-based organizations smuggling drugs through established relationships with corrupt officials was being replaced by larger, more aggressive organizations willing to use extreme violence to expand territory and eliminate competition. The Sinaloa Federation, led by Guzman and Zambada, was the dominant force driving this transformation. Their organization combined advanced trafficking logistics with the willingness to wage sustained campaigns against anyone who challenged their territorial claims. Other organizations, including the Gulf Cartel, had to match that capability or accept being pushed out of lucrative corridors. OCL was not willing to accept a lower-ranking position. His personality was characterized by ambition, aggression, and a willingness to escalate conflicts rather than seek compromise. These traits had helped him rise to leadership of the Gulf Cartel during the chaotic period following Garcia Abrego's arrest. Now, they drove him to seek a decisive advantage over increasingly powerful rivals. He understood that conventional cartel muscle, the street-level gunmen every trafficking organization employed, was not sufficient to compete with the Sinaloa Federation's growing military capability. Traditional cartel enforcers were recruited from the communities where cartels operated. They were tough and willing to use violence, but they lacked formal military training, tactical discipline, and the ability to conduct coordinated operations. They could intimidate local populations and eliminate individual targets, but they could not fight sustained engagements against organized opposition. What OCL wanted was the kind of tactical discipline that only professional military training could provide. He turned to a group of military defectors who had exactly the skills he needed. The irony of this recruitment is difficult to overstate. GAFE soldiers had been trained, in part, through programs designed to strengthen Mexico's ability to combat trafficking groups. Some of the training had been provided through cooperation with the United States military, which invested in Mexican Special Forces capabilities as part of broader counter-trafficking efforts. The skills that these soldiers brought to Los Zetas, including surveillance techniques, weapons expertise, communication security, interrogation methods, and tactical planning, had been developed and refined through programs funded by the very governments that would later struggle to contain the organization those skills helped create. According to published accounts of cartel history, the Gafe deserters who formed the original core of Los Zetas brought capabilities that no amount of criminal recruitment could have replicated. They understood how military intelligence operations worked, which meant they could anticipate and counter the methods that government forces would use against them. They knew how to establish and maintain secure communications, making it more difficult for investigators to intercept their coordination. They could plan and execute coordinated operations involving multiple teams across wide geo-clear areas, a capability that traditional cartel enforcer groups simply did not possess. These capabilities gave the Gulf Cartel, and later the independent Los Zetas organization, a military advantage that, at its core, altered the balance of power in Mexican organized crime. Other criminal organizations were forced to respond by militarizing their own operations, recruiting former military and police personnel, and acquiring heavier weapons. This arms race, triggered by OCL's initial decision to recruit Gafe deserters, escalated the level of violence across the entire country and changed the nature of cartel warfare from localized enforcement actions to sustained military-style campaigns involving armored vehicles, automatic weapons, and coordinated assaults on both rival organizations and government forces. Mexico's Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, known as GAFE, was an elite military unit trained in special operations, advanced weapons systems, and urban combat tactics. Its members received training from both Mexican military programs and foreign special operations schools, including facilities in the United States. They were among the most capable combat soldiers in Latin America, trained to operate in conditions that would overwhelm conventional military personnel. In the late 1990s, Ociel Cárdenas Guillén began recruiting deserters from GAFE. These were men who had been trained at government expense to fight rebels and protect national security. They understood tactical planning, weapons maintenance, surveillance techniques, interrogation methods, and coordinated assault operations. Now, they would use those skills not in service of the Mexican state, but in service of a trafficking organization. They became known as Los Zetas. The original Zetas were not independent operators. They were recruited specifically to serve as Ociel's personal enforcement arm, answerable to him directly and deployed at his command. Their initial missions were straightforward by cartel standards, but carried out with a professionalism that set them apart from every other armed group operating in Mexican organized crime. They protected Ociel personally, providing close security with discipline and coordination that traditional cartel bodyguards could not match. They eliminated rival traffickers who threatened Gulf Cartel operations, conducting targeted killings with military precision. They enforced discipline within the organization, ensuring that lower rankings followed orders and that financial obligations were met. And they secured smuggling routes, using their training to establish checkpoints, conduct surveillance, and execute operations against anyone who interfered with Gulf Cartel shipments. Unlike traditional cartel gunmen who operated through intimidation and reactive violence, Los Zetas functioned with military discipline and a formal command structure. They had ranks, active protocols, and chain-of-command procedures that reflected their military training rather than the informal hierarchies typical of criminal enterprises. Ociel gave them everything they needed to operate at that level. He provided weapons, including military-grade equipment that most cartel operations did not possess. He gave them authority to act on his behalf, meaning their orders carried the weight of the cartel leader's personal command. He assigned them territory to control, expanding their reach beyond simple security duties. And he granted them freedom to act on their own, allowing them to make tactical decisions without seeking approval for every action. In giving them power, he also gave them the tools to eventually operate without him. Over time, Los Zetas expanded beyond their original enforcement role. They moved into taking hostages, targeting individuals for money as an additional revenue stream that required no product supply chain to operate. They developed forced payment operations, forcing businesses and individuals to pay protection fees. They expanded into smuggling people and fuel theft, tapping into criminal markets that the Gulf Cartel had not traditionally dominated. Each of these activities generated independent revenue, reducing their financial dependence on the trafficking operations that OCL controlled. They were building their own economic foundation, while still operating under Gulf Cartel authority. At the time, this expansion was tolerated because it appeared to strengthen the overall organization. Los Zetas were generating income, maintaining territorial control, and projecting military power that kept rivals at a distance. From OCL's perspective, their growth made his organization more powerful and more feared. But a fundamental tension was building beneath the surface. Los Zetas were becoming more powerful, more independent, and more self-sustaining with each passing year. They answered to OCL because he had recruited them, and because his authority over the Gulf Cartel gave him the power to direct their operations. Remove that authority, and the question became unavoidable. Why would a trained army continue taking orders from anyone? That question was about to be answered, because OCL's time in power was running out. The dynamics driving the eventual split were visible years before the formal separation. Intelligence analysts noted several warning signs that the arrangement was becoming unsustainable. The first was the expansion of Zeta recruitment beyond the original core of military deserters. As Los Zetas grew, they recruited from street gangs, local criminals, former police officers, and impoverished communities. This recruitment transformed the organization's character from a small, elite military unit answering to a single cartel leader into a large, varied criminal enterprise with its own internal culture and identity. The second was the development of the Zeta brand as an independent force within the criminal landscape. The name itself became a source of reputation and fear, independent of the Gulf Cartel. When Los Zetas committed violence or seized territory, the credit accrued to the Zeta identity rather than the Gulf Cartel. Over time, this created a mental separation that preceded the organizational one. The third and most critical sign was the development of independent financial structures that reduced Zeta dependence on Gulf Cartel trafficking revenue. Los Zetas' expansion into taking hostages, forced payments, smuggling people, and fuel theft created revenue streams they controlled entirely, without Gulf Cartel involvement. Financial independence removed the primary lever of control that the Gulf Cartel held over its enforcement wing. Each of these developments was tolerated because they appeared to strengthen the overall organization in the short term. More recruits meant more control. The brand kept rivals away. Independent revenues supplemented total income. But from a long-term perspective, every one of those developments was making an eventual split more likely and more destructive. According to official Mexican government reports, on March 14, 2003, military forces captured Ociel Cardenas Guillen in Matamoros. The arrest of the Gulf Cartel's supreme leader sent immediate shockwaves through the organization, but it did not destroy it. Criminal organizations with deep corruption networks and established revenue streams can survive leadership transitions if the transition is managed effectively and if existing power structures remain functional. Initially, OCL managed the Gulf Cartel from prison. Through middlemen, he communicated orders, directed active decisions, and maintained influence over the organization's path. Mexico's prison system at the time was widely recognized as vulnerable to corruption, and imprisoned cartel leaders frequently continued directing their organizations from behind bars, through visits, smuggled communications, and cooperative prison officials. Then, in 2007, the arrangement changed completely. OCL was extradited to the United States. Extradition removed him from the Mexican prison system and placed him in U.S. federal custody. where communication with outside associates was controlled with a level of strictness that Mexican prisons did not enforce. He could no longer relay orders through middlemen with the same frequency or reliability. He could no longer manage territorial disputes or revenue distribution in real time. His physical separation from Mexico created a leadership vacuum that no amount of proxy communication could fill. The impact of extradition on cartel leadership is consistently underestimated by observers who focus on arrests as the key moment of disruption. In reality, the arrest of a cartel leader in Mexico often causes less organizational damage than the subsequent extradition to the United States. Arrest within Mexico allows the leader to continue operating through prison-based communication networks that have been refined over decades. Extradition severs those networks completely. The U.S. federal prison system operates with security protocols specifically designed to prevent imprisoned criminal leaders from continuing to direct their organizations. Communication is monitored. Visits are controlled. Access to phones and electronic communications is restricted. For a cartel leader accustomed to managing a multi-billion-dollar organization through constant communication with lower rankings, the transition from Mexican imprisonment to U.S. imprisonment effectively ends their active role. For OCL, extradition did not just remove him from daily management. It eliminated the individual power that held the Gulf Cartel's power structure together. The Gulf Cartel under OCL had been organized around his personal relationships with lower-ranking leaders. He decided who controlled which territory. He resolved disputes between competing factions. He determined how revenue was distributed. These decisions were made based on his personal judgment and enforced by his direct leadership. When he was no longer available to make those decisions, no one had the legitimacy or the power to make them on his behalf. Middlemen could relay general instructions, but they could not replicate the kind of real-time, adaptive decision-making that managing a large criminal organization requires. Situations that needed immediate resolution, a territorial dispute, a hijacked shipment, a compromised corruption contact, had to be handled by whoever was on the ground, often without guidance from the top. This decentralized decision-making led to inconsistent responses and growing friction between regional commanders who had different ideas about how the organization should operate. Within the Gulf Cartel, factions began competing for control. Different regional commanders asserted authority over their territories, and disagreements over revenue and active decisions that OCL would have resolved personally now had no clear mechanism for resolution. The organization that had functioned under a single dominant leader began splitting along lines of personal ambition and geo-clear control. Meanwhile, Los Zetas continued operating at full capacity. They controlled territory across northeastern Mexico. They generated substantial revenue through their varied criminal operations. They maintained military-grade capabilities that made them the most feared armed group in the region. And with every month that passed without OCL's direct supervision, they moved further from their role as a lower-ranking enforcement wing towards something altogether different. By 2008 and 2009, tensions between the Gulf Cartel's remaining leadership and Los Zetas were escalating. The Gulf Cartel still considered Los Zetas' lower rankings, an enforcement wing that existed to serve the cartel's interests and that owed its existence to the cartel's original investment. Los Zetas increasingly viewed themselves as equals, an organization that had outgrown its original role and that deserved recognition as a co-equal power. The relationship between protector and employer was collapsing, and both sides understood what that meant. Revenue disputes intensified the conflict. As Los Zetas expanded their independent criminal operations, questions arose about how income should be divided. Gulf Cartel leaders expected a share of Zeta earnings, viewing the enforcement wing as part of their organization, regardless of who had generated the specific revenue. Los Zetas resisted, viewing their independent earnings as the product of their own operations and their own capabilities, not something owed to an organization whose imprisoned leader could no longer direct daily operations. Personal conflicts between Gulf Cartel figures and Zeta commanders added fuel to the growing confrontation. Trust broke down at the individual level as well as the organizational level. Men who had once worked side by side now viewed each other with the kind of suspicion that, in cartel culture, typically precedes violence. By early 2010, the suspicion had reached its limit. What followed was one of the most violent organizational splits in the history of Mexican organized crime. In 2010, according to reports from Mexican security agencies, Los Zetas formally split from the Gulf Cartel. The immediate trigger involved the removal of a Zeta member by Gulf-affiliated figures, an event that shattered whatever remaining trust existed between the two groups. Once that line was crossed, there was no mechanism for reconciliation. The enforcement wing and the cartel that had created it were now at war. Northeastern Mexico became a battlefield on a scale that shocked even a country accustomed to cartel violence. The states of Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, and Coahuila, regions where both organizations had established deep, active presence, turned into active conflict zones. The fighting was not confined to remote areas. It took place in cities, along major highways, and in communities where civilian populations had no ability to escape the violence surrounding them. Urban confrontations erupted in broad daylight. Mass abductions targeted anyone suspected of supporting the opposing side. Roadblocks set up by both factions disrupted commerce and travel across the entire region. Mass attacks occurred as each side attempted to intimidate the other into retreat. The violence reached levels that drew international attention and forced the Mexican government to deploy additional military forces into the affected states. The scale of the conflict was made possible by the very capabilities that OCL had built into Los Zetas. Their military training enabled coordinated operations across wide, geo-clear areas. Their tactical discipline allowed them to sustain prolonged engagements rather than relying on hit-and-run tactics. Their access to advanced weapons gave them firepower that matched or exceeded what local law enforcement could deploy. And their organizational structure, modeled on military command hierarchies rather than informal cartel structures, allowed them to replace losses, coordinate between units, and maintain active tempo over months of continuous fighting. The Gulf Cartel responded by forming alliances with other cartels opposed to Los Zetas. These alliances brought additional fighters and resources into the conflict, but they were fragile and opportunistic arrangements between groups that had been rivals before their common enemy emerged. Those alliances could not fully compensate for the loss of the enforcement capability that Los Zetas had previously provided to the Gulf Cartel. The army OCL had created was now the single greatest threat to the survival of his organization. Los Zetas did not merely fight for territory in the Northeast. They expanded aggressively across Mexico, recruiting new members, establishing operations in states far from their original base, and building a national presence that transformed them from a regional enforcement wing into one of the most feared criminal enterprises in the country. Their varied criminal operations, built during the years when they had been allowed to develop independent revenue streams under Gulf Cartel authority, gave them the financial resources to sustain prolonged warfare and expansions simultaneously. No rival organization or federal task force caused this collapse. This was an internal power realignment among men that one leader had personally empowered, trained, armed, and trusted with the most sensitive aspects of his operations. The enforcement wing had become a rival cartel, and the war between them would destabilize northeastern Mexico for years. The scale of destruction caused by the Gulf Zeta split cannot be overstated within the context of Mexican organized crime. Before the split, the combined Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas organization controlled a vast territory stretching across northeastern Mexico. They had established a system of governance in many areas, collecting taxes from businesses, mediating disputes, and providing a form of intense order that, while criminal in nature, maintained predictability. When that system collapsed into open warfare, the affected communities experienced a level of violence that exceeded anything they had previously known. Tamaulipas, the state that had been the Gulf Cartel's base of operations since its founding, became one of the most dangerous places in the Western Hemisphere during the height of the conflict. Entire towns were emptied as residents fled fighting between the two factions. Local businesses were forced to close or pay protection money to whichever faction controlled their area on any given week, as territorial lines shifted with each engagement. Local federal agents, already compromised by decades of cartel corruption, was completely overwhelmed by the military-grade violence occurring in their legal systems. The Mexican government deployed thousands of additional military personnel to the region, but even that response could not contain the violence generated by two well-armed organizations fighting for control of the same territory. The conflict also exposed a fundamental truth about Ociel's decision to recruit military professionals. The skills and discipline that had made Los Zetas effective as an enforcement wing made them equally effective as an independent fighting force. Their military training had not been designed for temporary use. It was permanent capability that remained with them regardless of organizational affiliation. When they turned those capabilities against their former employers, the Gulf Cartel discovered that it had spent years strengthening the very force that was now trying to destroy it. Revento from the war zones declined sharply as trafficking operations were disrupted by constant fighting. Routes that had been secure under unified control became contested corridors where shipments were seized or destroyed by opposing factions. The economic damage compounded the military pressure, creating a cycle of declining resources and increasing desperation that drove both organizations toward more extreme violence in attempts to gain decisive advantage. After his extradition in 2007, Ociel Cárdenas Guillén faced federal charges in U.S. District Court in Texas. The charges included trafficking conspiracy, money laundering, threatening U.S. federal agents, and organized crime charges activity. In 2010, while his former army tore apart his former organization across northeastern Mexico, Ociel pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 25 years in U.S. federal prison. The sentence reflected some level of credit for assistance, though the full extent of any assistance he provided to prosecutors was not publicly detailed. His imprisonment ended any possibility of reasserting control over an organization that had already fragmented beyond recognition. With good behavior credits and time served, Ociel was eventually released to U.S. immigration custody. In 2022, he was deported to Mexico, where he faced potential additional legal proceedings. His deportation returned him to a country that had been transformed by the consequences of his decisions. The Mexico that Ociel left as an extradited prisoner in 2007 was already experiencing significant cartel violence. The Mexico he returned to in 2022 had endured more than a decade of sustained warfare between criminal organizations, much of it traceable directly or indirectly to the Gulf Zeta split that his creation of Los Zetas had made possible. The human cost of that split cannot be reduced to statistics, though the numbers themselves are staggering. Thousands of individuals were lost in the fighting between the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas in northeastern Mexico. Many of those affected were not fighters, but ordinary people caught in the crossfire or targeted because of suspected affiliations with one side or the other. Communities were displaced, local economies were destroyed, social fabric was torn apart in ways that have not been fully repaired even years after the most intense fighting subsided. Ociel did not order or direct any of this violence from his U.S. prison cell, but he set in motion the chain of events that led to it by making a single strategic decision years earlier. The creation of Los Zetas was intended to solve a specific problem. The Gulf Cartel needed better security against increasingly powerful rivals. The solution worked as intended for as long as Ociel maintained personal control over the organization. The moment that control was removed through his arrest and extradition, the solution became the problem. And the problem proved far more destructive than anything the original threat from rival organizations could have produced. By that time, the Gulf Cartel he had commanded bore no resemblance to the empire he had led. It had fragmented into smaller factions competing for diminished territory and revenue.
Los Zetas themselves had later fractured into splinter groups, victims of the same internal pressures that had destroyed their parent organization.
The unified criminal empire that Ociel had built through aggression, corruption, and military recruitment dissolved into a collection of regional groups with limited centralized coordination. The war between Gulf Cartel remnants and Los Zetas weakened both organizations permanently, creating space for other criminal groups to expand into territory that had once been firmly controlled by one or the other. Ociel did not betray his cartel through testimony. His damage was different and arguably more consequential. He created and empowered a force that operated beyond his control once his arrest removed him from direct supervision. He provided military training, weapons, territory, and authority to men who used those resources to build an independent empire. Every capability that made Los Zetas dangerous had been provided by the Gulf Cartel itself, at Ociel's personal direction. He raised them as protectors. They became competitors, and in the process, both the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas suffered damage that neither organization ever fully recovered from. In organized crime, the line between lieutenant and successor is thin, and sometimes the army you build becomes the one that dismantles everything you created. If you're still watching at this point, make sure you're subscribed. We cover cases like this every week, and your support helps us keep going. Ociel Cárdenas Guillén armed outsiders who turned against him. But the next case involves someone who did not need to be recruited at all because he was born directly into cartel royalty and still chose to testify against it. Case 3. Vicente Zambada Niebla, the heir who testified against the empire that raised him. Vicente Zambada Niebla was born in 1975 in Mexico. He did not choose to enter organized crime. He was born into it. His father, Ismael Zambada Garcia, known as El Mayo, was one of the founding leaders of the Sinaloa cartel. From the day Vicente was born, he existed inside a criminal empire that moved thousands of kilograms of product from Colombia through Mexico into the United States every year. His future was not something he selected from a list of options. It was assigned to him by the family he was born into.
The distinction between recruitment and inheritance matters for understanding what happened later. Most individuals who cooperate with federal authorities against criminal networks entered those organizations by choice at some point in their lives. They made a decision to participate. Vicente had no such entry point. His connection to the Sinaloa cartel was familial, established at birth, reinforced through upbringing, and formalized through gradual integration into the organization's working structure as he reached adulthood. Unlike most cartel figures, he never worked his way up through years of low-level trafficking. He was part of the bloodline. Vicente grew up during the period when the Sinaloa trafficking network was expanding from a regional operation into a global enterprise. The 1980s and 1990s saw the network forming alliances with Colombian product suppliers, establishing smuggling corridors into Arizona, California, and Texas, and building the systems that would eventually make the Sinaloa cartel the dominant force in international trafficking. These were the decades when the foundation was being laid, and Vicente was raised inside that construction. As the son of El Mayo, he had direct access to leadership figures that other aspiring traffickers could spend entire careers trying to reach. He did not need to prove himself through years of dangerous street-level work before earning a meeting with the men who made decisions. He was already in the room. already trusted by virtue of his bloodline, and already being prepared for a role within the organization's management structure. That preparation focused on the logistics side of operations rather than enforcement. Vicente was not groomed to be a gunman or a territorial commander. He was groomed to coordinate the movement of product, manage supply chains, and oversee the systems that converted product production in South America into revenue in North American markets. By the early 2000s, that grooming had translated into active responsibility. Federal prosecutors later identified him as a key figure in the movement of multi-ton quantities across international borders. He coordinated shipments arriving from Colombia, managing the connections between South American suppliers and Mexican transportation networks. He oversaw cross-border delivery systems that moved product from Mexico into the United States. He handled distribution logistics that connected border crossings to wholesale markets in American cities. And he worked alongside high-ranking cartel leaders on strategic decisions about routes, timing, and resource allocation. By the mid-2000s, the Sinaloa cartel was at the peak of its power. Its leadership included both Vicente's father, Ismael Zambada Garcia, and Joaquin Guzman. Together, they controlled a criminal empire that generated billions of dollars and operated across multiple continents. Vicente worked within that leadership framework, coordinating operations that were central to the cartel's revenue generation. Court filings alleged that he coordinated shipments from Colombia, oversaw distribution networks, communicated directly with suppliers and transport cells, and helped structure smuggling routes. The volume of product involved thousands of kilograms annually. His family name shielded him from the street-level dangers that other operatives had to navigate. He had protection, access to the highest levels of leadership, active authority over significant portions of the supply chain, and financial benefits from the trafficking profits his work generated. His position appeared unassailable. He was inside the most influential cartel in the world, connected by family to one of its founders, and operating at a level where arrest seemed unlikely and consequences seemed distant. Then, federal authorities arrived at his door, and the calculation that had defined his entire life changed overnight. On March 18, 2009, according to Mexican government statements, Mexican federal authorities arrested Vicente Zambada Niebla in Mexico City during an operation targeting high-level Sinaloa leadership figures. The arrest of El Mayo's son sent a clear signal that Mexican authorities were willing to target even the most protected members of the cartel chain of command, regardless of family connections or the corruption networks that shielded them. In 2010, he was transferred to U.S. custody and brought before a federal court in Chicago. The charges included conspiracy to distribute illegal substances and trafficking offenses involving multi-ton quantities. The evidence against him had been assembled over years through intelligence gathering, communications intercepts, informant testimony, and detailed analysis of seizure records connected to Sinaloa operations. Facing federal prosecution in the United States changed his calculation entirely. In Mexico, cartel leaders with deep corruption networks could sometimes influence legal proceedings. Prison conditions could be managed through bribery and intimidation. Communication with the outside world could be maintained through cooperative officials and system-level weakness. Extradition to the United States eliminated every one of those advantages. U.S. federal courts operated outside the reach of Mexican cartel corruption, and the sentencing exposure for large-scale trafficking conspiracy meant potential life imprisonment in a system where sentences were enforced as imposed. Initially, Vicente mounted a legal defense that attracted significant attention. His attorneys claimed he believed he was operating under an immunity agreement connected to U.S. federal agencies. The claim suggested that some level of cooperation or understanding had existed between elements of the Sinaloa cartel and American federal authorities, an allegation that raised uncomfortable questions about the relationship between U.S. agencies and cartel informants. The court ultimately rejected that defense,
but the claim itself generated extensive media coverage and public debate about the boundaries of government cooperation with criminal groups. With his immunity defense rejected and overwhelming evidence arrayed against him, Vicente's options narrowed severely. Going to trial risked conviction and a sentence that could mean spending the rest of his life in a U.S. federal prison. The alternative was cooperation, providing information about the cartel his family had built and led for decades. In 2013,
The son of one of the most heavily armed cartel leaders in Mexico entered into a formal deal to work with prosecutors, with U.S. prosecutors. The details of that agreement remained partially sealed, but its consequences would become publicly visible within a few years. His decision represented something rare in the history of Mexican organized crime. Associates, distributors, and mid-level operatives had cooperated before. But the son of a founding leader, a man raised inside the cartel from birth, choosing to work with federal prosecutors, was a different kind of event entirely. It was not just a legal decision. It was a fracture in the principle of family loyalty that had held the cartel's leadership structure together for decades. Family bonds were supposed to guarantee silence. Vicente's choice shattered that assumption. What he revealed on the witness stand would become part of the most significant cartel trial in modern American legal history. To understand the significance of what Vicente did, it is necessary to understand what silence means inside the Sinaloa cartel. The organization's survival across decades of law enforcement pressure from both the Mexican and American governments depended on the ability of its members to withstand interrogation, resist plea offers, and accept imprisonment rather than provide information to prosecutors. Silence was not merely a cultural expectation. It was an active requirement that every member of the organization understood from the moment they became involved. Members who maintained silence during prosecution were rewarded through the cartel's support networks. Their families received financial support while they were imprisoned. Their legal costs were covered through cartel-funded attorneys. Their status within the organization was protected, ensuring that they would have a position to return to upon release. These rewards created a powerful incentive to remain loyal, even when facing severe sentences. Members who broke silence faced consequences of equal severity, but in the opposite direction. Their families became targets. Their associates distanced themselves immediately. Their names became a symbol of betrayal within cartel culture, marking them permanently as individuals who could never be trusted again. The threat of violence against cooperators and their families was not theoretical. It was enforced consistently enough to serve as a credible warning for decades. Vicente's decision to cooperate was made with full knowledge of these consequences, which makes the calculation behind it all the more significant. He understood what silence meant, because he had been raised inside a system that enforced it. He understood what cooperation would cost him in terms of relationships, safety, and the possibility of ever returning to the world he had known. And he understood what cooperation would provide: a reduced sentence in a system where the alternative was spending the rest of his life in a federal prison. The fact that he chose cooperation, despite understanding all of these factors, demonstrated that even the deepest cultural conditioning can be overcome by the pressure of federal prosecution. The Sinaloa cartel's system of rewards for silence and punishment for cooperation had worked for decades. Vicente's case showed that it had limits. In 2018 and 2019, according to court records, the federal trial of Joaquin Guzman took place in Brooklyn, New York. The trial was the culmination of decades of federal agents' effort involving multiple countries, hundreds of agents, and some of the most complex international investigations ever conducted. The case required testimony from multiple government witnesses, each providing different angles on the Sinaloa cartel's operations, finances, and leadership structure. Vicente Zambada Niebla was among those witnesses. His testimony carried particular weight not only because of the information it contained, but because of who he was. This was not a former associate who had spent a few years working with the cartel before being arrested and flipped. He was a member of the founding family,
Someone who had been inside the cartel for his entire conscious life, who had been groomed into its management structure, and who had operated at its highest levels. On the witness stand, he described the cartel's chain of command, its logistics operations, and the coordination between its top leaders. He explained how trafficking routes functioned, detailing the systems that moved product from Colombian suppliers through Mexican territory and across the U.S. border into distribution networks. He described the working structure that connected leadership figures to transportation cells, distribution networks, and financial processing systems. He provided insight into how decisions were made at the top of the cartel, including the working relationship between his father, Ismael Zambada Garcia, and Joaquin Guzman.
This testimony was not second-hand information filtered through middlemen. It was first-hand, executive-level testimony from a man who had personally coordinated large-scale shipments and worked directly with the individuals he was describing. Federal prosecutors presented his testimony as insider insight into an organization that had operated with extreme secrecy for decades, maintained through violence, corruption, and the absolute loyalty of its inner circle. Inside cartel culture, public testimony represents one of the most severe breaches of loyalty possible. The code of silence is not merely tradition. It is a survival mechanism that protects the organization by ensuring that inside details, financial systems, and personnel identities remain hidden from investigators. When insiders testify publicly, they expose those details in a setting where the information becomes part of the permanent legal record, accessible to prosecutors, investigators, and rival organizations for years to come. Vicente did not merely plead guilty quietly and accept a sentence in exchange for reduced time. He took the stand and spoke publicly about the empire that raised him. His testimony contributed to the jury's understanding of the Sinaloa cartel's scope and operations in ways that external evidence alone could not have achieved. While wire intercepts, financial records, and surveillance footage could document specific activities and transactions, they could not explain the organizational logic behind those activities. Vicente's testimony provided that explanatory layer. He could describe why shipments were routed through specific corridors at specific times, providing the strategic context behind supply decisions that might otherwise appear arbitrary. He could explain the relationships between individuals who appeared in surveillance records, identifying who reported to whom and how authority was delegated within the cartel's chain of command. He could describe the decision-making processes that determined pricing, territorial allocation, and the resolution of internal disputes. This kind of contextual testimony transforms evidence from a collection of individual facts into a coherent narrative that a jury can follow and understand. Without it, prosecutors would have been forced to present the case as a series of disconnected events and transactions, leaving the jury to infer the connections between them. With Vicente's testimony, those connections were made explicit by someone who had participated in the decision-making processes that created them. The prosecution team's ability to present a coherent narrative of the Sinaloa cartel's operations was strengthened significantly by having an insider who could explain not just what happened, but why it happened and how it fit into the cartel's broader strategy. While the trial featured extensive physical evidence, recorded communications, financial documents, and testimony from multiple government witnesses, Vicente's insider perspective provided context that few other witnesses could match. His position within the organization's founding family gave him access to information that even high-ranking associates outside the bloodline did not possess. In 2019, Joaquin Guzman was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment plus 30 years. The conviction marked the end of one of the most extensive criminal careers in trafficking history. Vicente's assistance was one component of the prosecution effort that produced that outcome. but it was a component that carried particular significance because of the depth of trust his family had placed in the very system he described to prosecutors. After years of cooperation, Vicente Zambada Niebla was sentenced in 2019. He received 15 years in U.S. federal prison. For a defendant convicted of conspiracy to distribute massive quantities of product, a charge that carried potential life imprisonment, the 15-year sentence reflected substantial credit for his help granted by the court. The contrast with Guzman's sentence illustrated the value placed on cooperation. Guzman went to trial and received a life sentence. Vicente cooperated, testified, and received a sentence that would allow him to leave prison while the men he had described remained behind bars for the rest of their lives. The disparity demonstrated the federal system's willingness to reward cooperation even from individuals deeply embedded in the cartels they helped expose. The son of El Mayo had traded silence for survival, and the cost was measured in the secrets he gave away. His testimony and cooperation produced multiple impacts on the Sinaloa cartel. They strengthened federal understanding of the cartel's logistics and financial systems by providing details that external intelligence gathering had not been able to confirm independently. They contributed directly to the conviction of Joaquin Guzman by adding insider context to the physical and electronic evidence already in the prosecution's case file. And they exposed financial structures, smuggling methods, and leadership relationships in a public courtroom, information that had been closely guarded within the cartel's inner circle for decades. While the Sinaloa cartel did not collapse as a result of the trial, the proceedings left permanent marks on the cartel. Information that had been protected by layers of secrecy and violence was now part of the trial record. The principle of family loyalty, which cartel leadership had relied on as an absolute guarantee of silence, had been broken by the son of a founder. According to public records, Vicente remains in U.S. federal custody. El Mayo continued running Sinaloa cartel operations through evolving structures, but Vicente's case established a precedent that no one inside the organization could ignore. Bloodline membership did not guarantee silence under the pressure of federal prosecution. The broader implications extended beyond the specific information he provided. His assistance sent a message to every member of the group that the old rules no longer applied absolutely. If the son of El Mayo could testify in federal court, then no one was truly bound by the code of silence. The mental impact on an organization built on absolute loyalty was significant, even if it did not produce immediate organizational changes. For cartel leadership, the precedent created a new category of risk alongside traditional threats. Every family member with active knowledge became a potential government witness if arrested. Every trusted associate given access to sensitive information became a liability as well as an asset. The deeper the trust, the greater the potential damage. This dynamic creates a paradox that every criminal enterprise must confront but can never fully resolve. Organizations need trusted insiders to function at scale. They cannot operate without delegating authority, sharing sensitive information, and relying on individuals to manage critical operations independently. But every individual who receives that authority becomes a potential threat if circumstances change. The organization cannot function without trust, but trust creates vulnerability. The Sinaloa cartel addressed this tension through cultural conditioning, financial incentives, and violent consequences for betrayal. Vicente's case showed that all three mechanisms had limits. Cultural conditioning could not overcome the calculation that cooperation was preferable to spending a lifetime in prison. Financial incentives lost value when the alternative was decades in federal prison. And the threat of violence could be partially mitigated by witness protection and the geo-clear separation that U.S. custody provided. Vicente demonstrated that the most protected category of loyalty, family loyalty, was not absolute. He was not the first cartel figure to cooperate. But his bloodline made his assistance symbolically devastating in a way that other cases were not. He was raised in the system, grew up inside its structure, benefited from its protection and its wealth. And when the government presented him with a choice between loyalty and survival, he chose to survive. Before we continue, hit subscribe if you appreciate deep dives into cases that don't get the attention they deserve. Vicente Zambada Niebla broke the Sinaloa cartel's rule of silence from the witness stand. But the next cartel heir did his damage quietly by opening the financial books of the most advanced drug empire ever built.
Case 4. William Rodriguez Abadia, the cartel's son who cooperated against his father's empire. William Rodriguez Abadia grew up inside the Cali cartel at the peak of its power. His father, Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela, co-founded the organization alongside his brother, Gilberto. While Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel dominated headlines through attacks and open warfare against the Colombian state, the Cali cartel operated differently. Its founders built a criminal enterprise that functioned more like a multinational corporation than a traditional criminal group, and William was born into the center of it. According to U.S. federal estimates, at its peak in the early 1990s, the Cali cartel controlled an estimated 70 to 80% of the product entering the United States. That level of market dominance was achieved not through the kind of spectacular violence that defined the Medellin cartel, but through organized political corruption, deep law enforcement bribery, advanced money laundering operations, and international banking networks that moved drug revenue through legitimate financial systems across multiple continents. William Rodriguez Abadia grew up at the center of that empire. As the son of Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela, William grew up during the Cali cartel's rapid ascent from a regional trafficking operation to the dominant force in global product distribution. His childhood was not spent on the streets of a trafficking corridor. It was spent inside the financial and working networks of an organization generating billions of dollars in revenue and corrupting officials at every level of the Colombian government. The environment shaped his role within the organization. Unlike cartel figures who entered the trade through enforcement or street-level distribution, William was groomed into the financial side of operations from the beginning. His involvement centered on money laundering and logistics management, the two functions that kept the Cali cartel's global enterprise running. He was learning how to move money through international banking systems, establish corporate fronts, and manage the financial systems that converted trafficking revenue into usable wealth. He was being prepared to manage the empire's finances for decades to come. This was careful training inside a criminal corporation operating at global scale. The distinction between the Cali cartel's approach and the Medellin cartel's approach is important for understanding both William's role and the nature of the damage his assistance later caused. The Medellin cartel, under Pablo Escobar, had been organized around a single charismatic leader who managed operations through personal command and the threat of extreme violence. When Escobar fell in 1993, the Medellin cartel collapsed rapidly because its organizational structure depended entirely on his personal presence. The cartel had been an extension of one man's personality, rather than a system-level structure capable of surviving his removal. The Cali cartel was designed differently. The Rodriguez Orejuela brothers built an organization that was intended to function as a system rather than as an extension of individual personalities. Decision-making was distributed across a network of managers, each responsible for specific aspects of operations. Financial management was handled through system-level structures, corporate entities, banking relationships, and professional advisors, rather than through informal personal arrangements. The goal was to create an organization that could survive the loss of any individual, including its founders, by embedding its capabilities in systems rather than in people. William was trained to operate within and manage those systems, which meant his knowledge was not just personal, but system-level. He understood not only what the Cali cartel did, but how it did it. The procedures, the protocols,
the decision-making frameworks, and the system-level relationships that allowed the organization to process massive revenue while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business activity. This system-level knowledge was far more dangerous to the organization than personal knowledge about specific individuals or events, because system-level knowledge could be used to dismantle the systems themselves rather than merely identify the people who operated within them. The Cali Cartel needed individuals it could trust absolutely to manage the most sensitive aspects of its financial operations, and family members were considered the most trustworthy candidates available. William was prepared for that role from a young age, and he fulfilled it as he reached adulthood. He was not merely a relative who happened to share a name with a cartel founder. He was active, trained, and integrated into the financial machinery of the organization. When Colombian authorities arrested his father and uncle in 1995 and 1996, the Cali Cartel's top leadership structure collapsed publicly. The arrests were celebrated as landmark victories in the war on drugs, but the underlying financial networks did not disappear with the leaders who had created them. International laundering channels, overseas business fronts, and hidden asset structures continued functioning in various forms, managed by individuals who understood the systems and had the connections necessary to keep them active. Federal prosecutors later alleged that William's involvement continued after his father's arrest. He remained connected to trafficking and laundering schemes tied to remnants of the organization, helping sustain international connections that the Cali Cartel had spent years building. The arrests of the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers were supposed to end the Cali Cartel's dominance. For William, they marked the beginning of a different chapter, one that would eventually lead through fugitive life in Brazil to cooperation with the same American government that had targeted his father. The financial systems that William had been trained to manage represented the Cali Cartel's most lasting contribution to international trafficking. While the Medellin cartel had pioneered trafficking on a massive scale, it was the Cali Cartel that perfected the financial systems necessary to process the enormous revenues that trafficking generated. That systems included banking relationships in dozens of countries, shell corporations registered across multiple legal systems, real estate investments that converted drug cash into legitimate property holdings, and a network of financial professionals who facilitated transactions while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business activity. The sophistication of these systems was remarkable by the standards of any criminal enterprise. The Cali Cartel employed accountants, lawyers, and bankers who managed its financial operations with the same attention to detail and regulatory awareness that legitimate multinational corporations applied to their own finances. The difference was that the underlying revenue came from product sales rather than legal commerce, and the primary objective was concealment rather than compliance. William grew up understanding these systems because they were part of his daily environment, as natural to him as legitimate business practices would be to the child of a corporate executive. He understood how money moved through the banking system because he had watched it happen. He understood how shell corporations were structured because he had been involved in creating and managing them. He understood how asset concealment worked because he had participated in the process of hiding wealth generated by trafficking behind layers of corporate ownership and international transfers. This knowledge was not academic. It was practical, acquired through direct participation in operations that processed enormous sums over the course of the Cali Cartel's years of dominance. That practical knowledge is exactly what made his cooperation so valuable to federal prosecutors years later. External investigators could trace financial flows through banking records and corporate filings, but they could not explain the intent behind specific transactions, the relationships between apparently unconnected entities, or the decision-making process that determined how money was routed through the system. Only an insider with Williams' level of involvement could provide that context, and that context transformed raw financial data into evidence that could support criminal charges and asset seizure actions. After Colombian crackdowns intensified, William Rodriguez Abadia left the country.
Colombia was no longer safe for someone carrying the Rodriguez Orejuela name and connected to ongoing criminal activity tied to the remnants of the Cali cartel's operations. He eventually settled in Brazil, a country that had become both a transit hub for trafficking routes and a common destination for fugitives seeking to avoid extradition. Brazil's size, its complex legal system, and its limited extradition cooperation with certain countries during that period made it an attractive refuge for individuals fleeing prosecution elsewhere in Latin America. William did not arrive in Brazil under his own name. He lived under a false identity, using forged documentation to establish himself in a country where his real name would have drawn immediate authorities' attention. The decision to assume a false identity reflected both the severity of his legal exposure and the resources available to him. Creating and maintaining a convincing false identity in a foreign country required money, connections, and careful planning. Someone without the financial resources built up through cartel operations would have struggled to establish themselves abroad under an assumed name. William had access to those resources through the wealth his family's organization had generated. For a period, this strategy worked. He lived in Brazil without detection, maintaining a lifestyle funded by resources built up during the Cali cartel's years of dominance, while remaining outside the reach of Colombian and American prosecutors. The choice of Brazil as a refuge was not unusual among Colombian fugitives during this period. The country's geo-clear proximity to Colombia, its large population and sprawling urban centers that could absorb newcomers without attracting attention, and its historically limited extradition cooperation with certain countries made it a practical destination. Several high-profile Colombian trafficking figures and their associates had established themselves in Brazil during the late 1990s and early 2000s, creating informal networks that could assist new arrivals. William's ability to live under a false identity in a foreign country for an extended period illustrated both the resources available to him and the challenges facing international law enforcement in tracking fugitives who had the financial means to disappear effectively. Creating a convincing false identity required forged documentation of sufficient quality to pass scrutiny, establishing a plausible life story that could withstand casual questioning, maintaining financial resources without creating traceable connections to known criminal proceeds, and avoiding contact with individuals or locations that might attract federal authorities' attention. Each of these requirements demanded both financial resources and careful planning, capabilities that William had developed through years of managing the Cali cartel's financial operations. The same skills that had made him valuable to the cartel as a financial manager, the ability to move money discreetly, establish corporate structures that concealed true ownership, and maintain documentation that could withstand surface-level scrutiny, now served him in the task of concealing his own identity and location from international investigators. He was, in a sense, applying the techniques he had learned inside the cartel to the project of evading the consequences of his involvement with it. But international government investigators' coordination was tightening during this period. U.S. federal agencies, Colombian authorities, and Brazilian law enforcement were sharing intelligence about fugitives connected to major trafficking organizations with increasing effectiveness. According to federal records, in 2006, Brazilian authorities arrested William Rodriguez Abadia. The arrest resulted from coordinated international efforts involving Colombian, American, and Brazilian agencies. His false identity had been penetrated through intelligence sharing and investigative work that tracked his movements and financial activities across borders. Once in custody, the United States immediately sought his extradition. Brazil approved the request. William was extradited to face federal charges related to trafficking and money laundering in the American legal system, where cartel corruption networks had no reach and sentencing exposure was severe. The financial tracing documentation that prosecutors assembled was extensive. International money laundering at the Cali cartel's scale
left trails in banking systems, corporate registrations, and financial transfers that investigators had been following for years. Facing overwhelming evidence in a U.S. federal courtroom, William entered plea negotiations. The heir to the Cali Cartel's financial empire was about to become a cooperating witness against the empire he had been brought up within. In U.S. federal court, William Rodriguez Abadia pleaded guilty to trafficking and money laundering charges. His plea agreement included cooperation that required providing information to federal prosecutors about the Cali Cartel's operations, financial systems, and international networks. While full details remain sealed, public court records confirm he provided substantial information. The nature of that information reflected his unique position. Unlike violent enforcers who could describe working methods and territorial conflicts, William's knowledge centered on the financial architecture that had made the Cali Cartel the most profitable trafficking enterprise of its era. For prosecutors trying to dismantle international drug empires, financial intelligence is the most valuable kind of cooperation an insider can provide.
Drug shipments can be disrupted by seizures, but new shipments replace them. Armed enforcers can be arrested, but new recruits take their places. Financial networks, however, are far more difficult to rebuild once exposed. Banking relationships, offshore accounts, shell corporations, and laundering channels take years to establish and depend on secrecy to function. Once those systems are described to prosecutors and documented in court proceedings, they become targets for asset seizure, account freezing, and additional criminal charges against the financial professionals who facilitated them. Williams' cooperation included financial network details that explained how the Cali Cartel moved money through international systems. He provided working structure insight that clarified how different components of the organization interacted with its financial system. He explained historical mechanisms, giving prosecutors context about how the organization had evolved its laundering methods across different banking environments and regulatory regimes. He described specific systems, including banking relationships and corporate entities, used to disguise drug revenue as legitimate business income. This information was valuable because it came from someone trained inside the system. William had not learned about the Cali Cartel's finances through investigation or external analysis. He had been taught those systems directly, groomed into financial management by a father who needed trusted individuals to handle the most sensitive operations. He was groomed within the architecture, and now he was drawing prosecutors a detailed map of it. His information strengthened cases tied to the Cali Cartel's remaining international financial structures. Even though the cartel's top leadership had been imprisoned years earlier, financial remnants and laundering networks continued operating. Williams' information helped prosecutors identify and target those structures. The court gave him a shorter sentence as credit for his help, well below what others in comparable cases received. The dismantling of the Cali Cartel's financial systems through cases like Williams represents a model for attacking trafficking groups through their financial systems, rather than exclusively through drug interdiction. Seizures and arrests disrupt operations temporarily, but do not destroy the systems that generate and process revenue. Financial investigations and insider cooperation target the systems themselves, making it harder for organizations to rebuild after leadership arrests. The Cali Cartel's financial architecture had been designed to survive the arrest of any individual, including its founders. Corporate structures were layered so that no single person controlled all aspects of any financial operation. Banking relationships were distributed across institutions and countries. Real estate holdings were registered under corporate names difficult to trace to organizational leadership. Williams' cooperation undermined those protective layers because he understood how they fit together, something external investigators could only partially determine from financial records alone. His detailed knowledge allowed prosecutors to trace specific money flows to specific criminal activities, connecting front companies to trafficking proceeds and identifying the individuals who managed each layer of the financial system.
The Cali Cartel, once the world's dominant product syndicate, no longer exists in its original form. Its founders are imprisoned. Its financial networks were exposed. Its organizational structure dissolved into fragments that lacked both the scale and the sophistication of the original enterprise. The Cali Cartel's collapse illustrates a principle that applies across all 5 cases documented here. Criminal organizations are more vulnerable to financial disruption than to active disruption.
Drug shipments can be replaced. Arrested personnel can be substituted. Lost territory can be retaken. But financial systems, once exposed through insider cooperation, cannot simply be rebuilt with the same counterparties, accounts, and corporate structures. Banks that have been identified as cartel conduits face regulatory action. Corporate entities that have been flagged in court proceedings become useless for concealment purposes. Corruption contacts whose identities have been revealed to prosecutors can no longer provide protection. The exposure of the Cali Cartel's financial systems through Williams' cooperation and through parallel investigative efforts effectively eliminated the organization's ability to process the revenue that trafficking generated. Without the ability to launder, store, and invest drug proceeds, the economic engine that powered the cartel's operations stalled permanently. Successor organizations in Colombia adapted by developing different financial methods, but the specific systems that the Rodriguez-Orejuela brothers had built over decades was gone. Williams' contribution to that outcome was direct and significant. He provided the roadmap that allowed prosecutors to navigate a financial labyrinth that had been deliberately designed to resist exactly that kind of external scrutiny. He was raised within one of the most powerful drug empires in history. He learned its systems from the inside. He benefited from its protection. And when facing prosecution, he provided the insider knowledge that helped dismantle its remaining foundations. The most consequential betrayal of the Cali Cartel was not violent. It was financial, carried out by the son who had been trained to protect those exact systems. Hit subscribe before we continue. The next case might be the most shocking one yet. William Rodriguez Abadia cooperated after he was caught, arrested, and extradited. But the next 2 men started secretly recording their cartel bosses while they were still on the payroll and still moving large volumes of product every month. Case 5. The Flores twins, the trusted U.S. distributors who secretly recorded El Chapo. Pedro and Margarito Flores were born in Chicago to Mexican immigrant parents and raised in Little Village, a neighborhood on the city's southwest side with deep ties to both legitimate business and the underground economy. They were not born into cartel families. They did not grow up in Mexican trafficking corridors. They were American kids from a working-class neighborhood who found their way into organized crime through the same door that thousands of young men in similar neighborhoods have walked through. Proximity to a market that was always hiring. Their entry into organized crime followed a pattern common to many young men in neighborhoods where drug markets were part of the economic landscape. By their late teens and early 20s, the twins were involved in street-level drug sales. The operations were small compared to what would come later, but they provided the foundation of contacts and experience that allowed them to grow beyond local markets. What separated them from thousands of other street dealers was the scale of ambition they brought to the work and the opportunity that appeared before them. During the early 2000s, the Sinaloa cartel was aggressively expanding its distribution networks inside the United States. Chicago became a central hub for that expansion for practical reasons. The city's location in the center of the country provided transportation access to markets across the Midwest, East Coast, and South. Established Mexican trafficking corridors connected Chicago to supply sources along the border, and the wholesale demand for product in the region was strong and consistent. The Flores twins positioned themselves within that expanding network. They built connections that went beyond local distribution, linking themselves to supply chains originating in Mexico and ultimately in Colombia. Over time,
They graduated from local sales to large-scale wholesale distribution,
receiving large-scale shipments coordinated through Sinaloa cartel leadership. Federal court records later revealed the scale of their operation. By the mid-2000s, they were distributing huge amounts of illegal goods and handling multi-million-dollar cash proceeds. They coordinated international supply chains, connecting South American production to Mexican transportation to American street markets. They were no longer local traffickers. They were high-level wholesale distributors embedded in one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the world. And the leadership of the Sinaloa cartel trusted them because they had earned that trust through years of consistent, reliable performance. The twins built their reputation on qualities that cartel leadership valued above almost everything else. They paid their debts consistently, returning cash proceeds on time and in full. They moved product efficiently, without attracting the kind of investigators' attention that cost the cartel money and exposed its operations. And they maintained secrecy, keeping their activities kept separate and their public profiles low. Those qualities earned them something few American distributors ever achieved: direct communication with the top leadership of the Sinaloa cartel. By every measure available to them, the twins had achieved a position that should have sustained their business for years, possibly decades. The Flores twins' operation in Chicago represented the Sinaloa cartel's model for American distribution at its most effective. The cartel's strategy for penetrating the U.S. market relied on identifying reliable partners in key cities who could handle large volumes of product without creating the kind of disruptions that attracted authorities' attention. Chicago was the cartel's primary distribution hub for the entire central United States, and the twins were among its most important operators in that city. Their operation functioned as a bridge between two worlds. On the Mexican side, the cartel managed production, transportation through Mexican territory, and border-crossing logistics. Once the product entered the United States, the responsibility shifted to distributors like the Flores twins, who managed storage, wholesale distribution, retail-level sales through lower rankings, and the critical process of collecting and returning cash proceeds to Mexico. The cash return process was particularly important and particularly complex. Product sold in American cities generated enormous quantities of physical currency, predominantly in small denominations. That currency had to be collected from street-level dealers, combined at secure locations, counted and packaged for transportation, and then moved across the border back to Mexico. The logistics of moving millions of dollars in physical cash without detection required planning, personnel, transportation networks, and knowledge of law enforcement interdiction patterns. The Flores twins managed this entire process for the Chicago market, handling both the distribution of incoming product and the return of outgoing cash, with a level of efficiency that justified the cartel's trust in them. Their operation also required managing the human systems that supported distribution. They oversaw networks of lower-ranking distributors, drivers, counters, and storage operators. Each individual in those networks represented both an asset and a risk, because any one of them could be arrested and pressured into cooperating with federal authorities. Managing those networks meant maintaining discipline, ensuring loyalty, and responding quickly to any sign that a member of the operation had been compromised. The scale of their operation also meant they were constantly managing relationships with suppliers, transporters, and other criminal groups operating in the Chicago market. Drug distribution at the wholesale level involves interactions with dozens of different organizations and individuals, each with their own interests, capabilities, and potential for creating problems. The twins navigated those relationships while maintaining the secrecy and reliability that the Sinaloa cartel demanded. In cartel culture, direct communication with top leadership is reserved for the most trusted individuals within the organization. Mid-level distributors interact with regional coordinators and transportation managers.
Only those who have demonstrated exceptional reliability over extended periods earn the privilege of speaking directly with the men who control the entire enterprise. The Flores twins reached that level. Federal court evidence later revealed recorded conversations between the twins and Joaquin Guzman himself. They also communicated with Ismael Zambada Garcia. These were not intermediary contacts relayed through lower rankings.
These were direct conversations between American distributors and the two strongest drug traffickers in Mexico. That level of access meant the cartel's leadership considered them essential partners in their American operations. The scope of their responsibilities reflected that trust. They managed shipments arriving from Mexico, coordinating receipt, storage, and distribution across their network. They handled cash returns via bulk currency smuggling, ensuring drug proceeds moved back to cartel leadership in Mexico. They conducted international coordination between suppliers, transporters, and distribution-level operators, serving as the critical link between the cartel's production systems and its revenue generation in American markets. Financially, the twins handled tens of millions of dollars in proceeds. The cash generated by distributing large volumes of product created significant practical problems. Large quantities of currency had to be collected, counted, combined, transported, and delivered back to Mexico without detection. The Flores twins managed that process as part of their portfolio of responsibilities. They operated at a level that few US-based distributors ever reach. Their position was strategic, not merely commercial. The Sinaloa cartel depended on reliable American distribution networks to convert product into cash, and the Flores twins were among the most productive and dependable partners in that network. That embedded trust, built over years of reliable work and proven loyalty, is what made their next decision so devastating to the group that relied on them. By 2008, U.S. federal authorities were building cases against the twins. Federal pressure was mounting, and the evidence being assembled pointed toward charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. The twins understood what was coming and recognized that their options were narrowing with each passing month. They faced a choice that every major trafficker eventually confronts when federal investigators close in: continue operating and risk arrest, trial, and a sentence that might consume the rest of their lives, or approach authorities and attempt to negotiate a different outcome. They chose the second option. But what made their work with prosecutors at its core different from most cases was timing. They did not wait to be arrested before working with the government. They began cooperating while still actively embedded in the Sinaloa cartel's distribution network, a decision that carried extraordinary personal risk, but produced evidence of extraordinary value. The difference between post-arrest cooperation and active cooperation is significant. Post-arrest cooperators provide information based on memory, recounting events that have already occurred and describing structures that may have changed. Active cooperators provide real-time intelligence, recording conversations as they happen, documenting transactions as they occur, and capturing evidence that reflects current operations rather than historical practices. For prosecutors, real-time evidence from active cooperators is vastly more valuable. Recordings capture participants speaking in their own words about ongoing criminal activity. Transaction records document specific shipments and payments as they happen. This evidence is difficult for defense attorneys to challenge because it consists of, at the same time, documentation rather than reconstructed memories. The twins were simultaneously serving two masters: the Sinaloa cartel and the United States government. Every interaction served dual purposes. A call with Guzman about a shipment was both a business conversation for the cartel and an evidence-gathering operation for prosecutors. A cash return to Mexico fulfilled their cartel obligations while providing documented proof of the trafficking enterprise's scale. Every day they maintained this dual role. They built up evidence while preserving the cover that allowed continued access. The mental burden was extreme. They maintained convincing performances as loyal distributors, while knowing every conversation was recorded, every transaction documented, and eventual exposure would trigger violent payback from one of the most powerful criminal syndicates in the world. The extended duration of their active cooperation meant they lived under this pressure continuously for months. The risk extended beyond the twins themselves to their families. The Sinaloa cartel's enforcement practices included targeting the relatives of individuals who betrayed the organization, a policy that served as both punishment and warning. The twins' parents, siblings, and extended family members all became potential targets the moment the cooperation began, whether the cartel discovered it immediately or learned about it later through legal proceedings. The severity of this risk was demonstrated directly during the course of events. The twins' father was eliminated, an event that underscored the deadly consequences that cartel payback could take. The loss was a devastating personal cost that illustrated the price that cooperation extracted, even when it led to successful prosecutions and lighter sentences for the cooperators themselves. The willingness to accept that risk and to continue cooperating despite knowing what the consequences might include reflected the severity of the federal charges they were facing and the limited options available to them. Federal prosecutors and law enforcement agents working with the twins were aware of the danger to both the cooperators and their families. Protection measures were implemented, but the reach of the Sinaloa cartel's enforcement capability meant that complete security could not be guaranteed. The twins and their handlers operated in an environment where the possibility of discovery and violent payback was a constant factor in every decision. This aspect of the case highlights a dimension of cooperation that legal documents and sentencing proceedings do not fully capture. The shorter sentences that cooperating witnesses receive reflect the value of the information they provide to prosecutors. They do not fully account for the personal costs that cooperation imposes: the severing of community ties, the abandonment of identity, the constant awareness of physical danger, and, in this case, the loss of a family member to cartel violence. The twins' eventual 14-year sentences, while substantially reduced from the potential dying in prison they faced, were served in addition to these personal costs rather than instead of them. The full price of their work with prosecutors extended far beyond the years spent in federal custody. They started working with the government without stepping away from their role in the cartel's supply chain. In 2008, while still actively involved in trafficking operations, Pedro and Margarito Flores began secretly cooperating with U.S. federal authorities. This was not a standard post-arrest plea arrangement. This was active, real-time cooperation, conducted while the twins continued their established role as the Sinaloa cartel's top American distributors in the Chicago market. Under federal supervision, they recorded phone calls with cartel leaders. They wore recording devices during in-person interactions. They documented logistics discussions about shipment schedules, quantities, pricing, and delivery arrangements. They participated in monitored transactions that allowed federal agents to observe the mechanics of large-scale drug distribution as it happened. Every conversation they had with cartel leadership was being captured by the United States government. The recordings captured high-level discussions about drug shipments and inside details that cartel leadership believed were completely secure. When Guzman discussed business with the Flores twins, he was speaking with men he had trusted for years based on their established track record. He had no reason to suspect that those conversations were being recorded for use in a federal courtroom. The personal risk to the twins during this period was extreme. If cartel leadership discovered they were cooperating, the consequences would have been immediate and deadly. The Sinaloa cartel did not negotiate with informants or offer second chances to those caught cooperating with government authorities. Discovery would have meant the end for the twins and potentially for their families. A single slip, a single moment where a cartel contact sensed something wrong could have ended everything. Their work with authorities lasted for an extended period before their involvement with federal agents became public. During that time, they built up a body of evidence that documented the cartel's operations from the perspective of trusted insiders. The recordings provided proof of criminal activity
and insight into how the organization functioned at its most senior levels. By the time charges were publicly announced, federal prosecutors already had more evidence than most international trafficking cases ever produce. In 2009, the twins were arrested and charged in federal court in Chicago. The federal indictment covered large-scale distribution, money laundering, and international trafficking offenses. Because they had already been cooperating, the arrests were coordinated with prosecutors as part of a planned transition from active intelligence gathering to formal legal proceedings. The case file included recorded calls with cartel leadership, detailed shipment logs, financial documentation, and evidence mapping international trafficking routes from multiple angles. The nature of the evidence the twins produced deserves particular attention because it illustrates why insider cooperation is so damaging to criminal groups. Recorded conversations between drug traffickers and their leadership provide prosecutors with something that no amount of external surveillance can produce: direct evidence of criminal intent and criminal agreement spoken in the participants' own words. When law enforcement conducts surveillance of trafficking operations from the outside, it captures movements, meetings, and sometimes intercepted communications. But interpreting that evidence often requires extensive analysis and the construction of indirect cases that defense attorneys can challenge. When a cooperating insider records conversations directly, the resulting evidence is far more difficult to dispute.
The voices are identified. The context is known. The content speaks directly to the criminal activity being prosecuted. The Flores twins' recordings captured Joaquin Guzman discussing drug shipments, pricing, and logistics in conversations where he believed he was speaking with trusted business partners in complete privacy. That evidence carried enormous weight in the courtroom because it eliminated many of the defenses that high-level traffickers typically employ. A defendant cannot credibly claim ignorance of trafficking operations when his own voice is recorded discussing them in detail. The recordings stripped away the layers of insulation that cartel leaders build between themselves and the physical drug shipments, proving direct involvement in a way that intercepted phone calls between lower-level operatives could not.
The twins also provided prosecutors with the ability to confirm other evidence in the case. When financial records showed large cash movements between Chicago and Mexico, the twins could explain exactly what those movements represented. When surveillance footage showed meetings between cartel associates, the twins could identify participants and explain the purpose of those meetings. Their cooperation transformed isolated pieces of evidence into a coherent narrative of criminal enterprise that the jury could follow from supply through distribution to revenue return. This supporting value is another reason why insider cooperation is so devastating to criminal organizations. Individual pieces of evidence can be challenged, explained away, or contextualized differently by defense attorneys.
When a cooperating insider connects those pieces into a complete picture, the resulting case becomes far more powerful than the sum of its parts. The federal trial of Joaquin Guzman in Brooklyn brought together decades of international authorities' effort. The Flores twins' recorded conversations and testimony were a significant component of the prosecution's case, providing direct evidence of Guzman's personal involvement in trafficking decisions captured in his own voice during conversations with distributors he trusted completely. The men who had once been relied on to move product and return cash for the Sinaloa cartel were now helping prosecutors dismantle its leadership structure. Their testimony provided insight into direct communication with Guzman, the cartel's working structure, shipment volumes and logistics systems, and the cash return mechanisms that moved drug proceeds from American streets back to cartel leadership in Mexico. The prosecution presented evidence from many angles, but the Flores twins' recordings stood out as particularly damaging material because they captured conversations that cartel leadership believed were private and permanently secret. The jury found Guzman guilty on every charge. The sentence ensured he would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars.
The conviction represented the culmination of one of the most complex international criminal investigations in history, involving cooperation between federal agencies in multiple countries over a period spanning more than 2 decades. The significance of the conviction extended beyond the imprisonment of a single individual.
The trial itself served as a never-before-seen public accounting of how the Sinaloa cartel operated at every level, from product production in Colombian laboratories to retail distribution on American streets. Testimony from the Flores twins and other cooperating witnesses created a detailed record of the organization's structure, methods, and leadership that had never before been assembled in a public setting. For law enforcement agencies that had spent years investigating the Sinaloa cartel through surveillance, informant networks, and intelligence analysis, the trial provided confirmation and context for information that had been gathered through painstaking external investigation. For the broader public, the trial revealed the scale and sophistication of an organization that had operated largely in the shadows, despite being one of the top-ranking criminal enterprises in the world. The Flores twins' contribution to this outcome demonstrated the uneven impact that trusted insiders can have when they turn against the organizations they serve. Years of external investigation by multiple federal agencies across several countries had produced significant intelligence about the Sinaloa cartel's operations. But the evidence gathered by the twins during their period of active cooperation, recorded conversations with the cartel's supreme leader, documented transactions showing the flow of drugs and money, and first-hand testimony about active procedures, provided the kind of direct, irrefutable evidence that transformed a complex, indirect case into a straightforward prosecution. The contrast between the resources invested in external investigation and the evidence produced by 2 cooperating insiders illustrates why trafficking networks' greatest vulnerability comes from within rather than from outside. Billions of dollars spent on government investigators, surveillance technology, and international cooperation produced valuable intelligence. 2 men with recording devices and access to cartel leadership produced evidence that helped secure a conviction. The court credited both twins for their extensive cooperation, resulting in sentences far shorter than their trafficking activities would normally have warranted. The reduction reflected the length of their cooperation, the quality of evidence they produced, and their assistance in federal prosecutions. Both twins were later released after serving their sentences. Their current locations are not publicly known, consistent with security arrangements typically provided to witnesses who testified against major cartel figures. The Sinaloa cartel continues operating under evolving leadership structures. Guzman's conviction did not end the organization, but the recordings captured by the Flores twins became part of the permanent record, documenting how the largest trafficking enterprise in the world conducted its business at the highest levels. They were not brought up within the cartel. They were not family members of its leadership, but inside the system, they earned a level of trust that placed them in direct communication with the most powerful figures in Mexican organized crime. And from inside that circle of trust, they helped build one of the most consequential criminal cases in modern history. These 5 stories represent some of the most consequential examples of that cycle in action. An American who rose through the ranks and then used his position to fracture the empire. A leader who built the instrument of his own organization's destruction. A son who chose survival over family loyalty. A son who handed over the financial secrets of the largest trafficking fortune ever built. 2 business partners who recorded every conversation their employers thought was private. Different people, different organizations, different countries, different decades. The same result. The people they relied on most became the people who brought them down. If you enjoyed this deep dive into cartel insiders who destroyed the empires that raised them, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.